He thought he buried the past, until it played its way back. A mysterious melody, a young violinist with secrets, and a billionaire whose legacy may not be his to claim. What happens when music unearths a truth too painful to silence? A story of love, loss, and the echoes we leave behind. Subscribe now to our YouTube channel to uncover the truth piece by piece. This is not just a story, it's a confession wrapped in strings. The violin sang, trembling with a melody no one had ever heard before, raw, unfinished, heartbreakingly beautiful. The bow moved not with perfection, but with passion. Each note echoed in the hollow, broken space of the old theater, where the velvet seats had long lost their luster, and the chandeliers above hung like faded ghosts of grandeur. The boy playing was no more than 20. He stood center stage, surrounded by dust motes floating in shafts of tired sunlight. His eyes were closed, brows drawn together as if each note cost him something. The violin nestled against his shoulder looked worn, its wood dulled by time, its voice sharpened by grief. At the far end of the hall, in the only intact row of seats, a man sat alone. Julian Werner. Impeccably dressed in a dark coat, posture still regal despite the years that weighed on him, he watched the boy intently. No expression crossed his face, but something in the way he leaned forward betrayed an undercurrent, recognition maybe, or disbelief. The final note lingered in the air like a secret. Then silence. The boy lowered the violin slowly and opened his eyes. He didn't look at Julian. Instead, he turned his gaze upward toward the crumbling ceiling, as if searching for something long gone. His lips parted. "She used to hum that part differently," he said, not to Julian, not to anyone in particular, just to the room or to the memory that lived there. Julian didn't speak. He sat motionless, hands folded. The only sound around him was the faint creak of the wooden seat beneath his weight. The boy finally looked at him. Their eyes met, one full of unspoken pain, the other full of practiced stillness. "You're him, aren't you?" the boy asked quietly. "Julian Werner." Julian didn't nod. He didn't need to. The boy placed the violin gently back in its case, then walked down the aisle. As he passed Julian, he stopped for just a moment. From the inside pocket of his coat, he pulled out an envelope, thick and worn at the edges, and placed it on the empty seat beside the older man. Without another word, he walked away, his footsteps echoing long after he was gone. Julian didn't touch the envelope. Not yet. Rain tapped gently against the wide glass windows of the Werner estate, a soft, persistent rhythm like a clock ticking somewhere deep within the walls. The manor stood in silence, untouched by the bustle of the outside world, as though time itself respected the quiet. Julian stepped out of his car and walked alone through the grand entrance. The staff knew better than to greet him on this day. No one spoke. No one moved. It was the 5th anniversary of Arya's death. He loosened his tie as he ascended the staircase, not out of exhaustion but from something heavier, ritual. The same motions, the same steps every year. He paused at the top where a long hallway stretched ahead like a corridor through memory. At the far end, the music room. He opened the door slowly, not out of hesitation but reverence. Inside, the room was untouched, walls lined with framed concert posters, shelves of music scores stacked with obsessive precision, and in the center, encased in glass like a relic of a saint, was Arya's violin. It had been handcrafted in Cremona, its varnish amber-rich, the wood curved like a second voice. Julian stared at it for a long moment, then crossed the room to the old stereo. He knelt, pulled out a drawer of labeled tapes and found the one marked in Arya's handwriting, "For Julian." A soft click. A few seconds of white noise. Then her voice, fragile, warm, trembling on the edge of a smile. "If you're listening to this, it means you finally stopped working long enough to sit still. I hope it's raining. You always said music sounds better when the world is gray." Julian closed his eyes. He let the weight of her voice pour through him, a ghost wrapped in reel-to-reel warmth. She laughed faintly. I was thinking today, what if love isn't something that grows, but something that waits? Maybe we just find it, fully formed, waiting in some quiet corner of ourselves we haven't dared to open yet. He leaned back against the wall, head tilted up toward the high ceiling. The tape hissed softly between sentences like breath. I'm afraid, Julian, not of dying, but of leaving you with too much silence. His hand clenched slowly. The silence had come all right. It had bloomed into everything, into the walls, the hallways, even into his sleep. The recording clicked off. He didn't press rewind, didn't move. He just sat there in the room that once held music, and now only held him. Night fell softly over the estate, draping the manor in a hush of shadow and silver. Julian hadn't moved from the music room since the recording ended. Hours had passed in stillness, no calls, no thoughts worth chasing. The only light came from a single lamp in the corner, casting a quiet glow over Arya's violin. At some point, without knowing why, Julian left the room, perhaps to pour a drink, perhaps to escape her voice still echoing in his chest. When he returned, something was off. There was music. Faint at first, then stronger, notes drifting through the hallway like scent from another lifetime. He froze outside the door. The melody wasn't complete, hesitant in places, unsure in others, but it was unmistakably hers. He stepped inside. There, sitting on the piano bench with his back turned, was the boy, the same one from the theater, the one with eyes like unfinished sentences. Micah. He was playing with both hands now, right on piano, left holding the violin, drawing the bow across open strings between chords. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. It was haunting. Julian didn't speak. He didn't want to disturb the moment, even if it felt like a trespass. Micah stopped playing before the piece reached its natural end, as if he knew someone was behind him. He let the final note ring out, thin and shimmering, then gently rested the violin on the piano's lid. I didn't break in, he said, his voice low but steady. The door was unlocked. Julian didn't answer. Micah turned to face him. In the half-light, his features were soft, young, but worn by something deeper than age. I wasn't sure you'd come back, he added, but I hoped you would. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, creased, faded, handled too many times. He walked over to the piano, placed the letter gently beside the violin, then looked up at Julian one last time. I thought she might have told you, he said. Maybe she wanted to, maybe she didn't know how. Julian's eyes fell on the envelope, but he didn't touch it. Micah gave him a slight nod. No anger, no desperation, just a strange, aching calm. Then he turned and walked out the way he came, leaving only the music unfinished and the letter unopened. The room seemed colder after Micah left, as if he had carried some lingering warmth with him. Julian stood motionless for a long while, eyes fixed on the envelope resting beside Arya's violin. The past had already begun to breathe again, faintly, like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. Finally, with slow, deliberate hands, he picked it up. The paper was thin, worn at the folds. His name wasn't written on the front, no greeting, no flourish, just the weight of something long withheld. He sat down, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers as he unfolded it. The handwriting inside was neat, controlled, not Arya's. It read, "If you are Julian Werner, husband of Arya, then this letter may mean something to you. Or maybe it will only make things worse. I've thought about that a lot. I'm not writing for forgiveness or attention. I don't want your money. I don't need anything from you. But I think you deserve the truth. Arya was my mother, or the only mother I ever knew. She never told me much about you, except that you were impossible to forget and impossible to fully love. She said it like she was protecting you from something, or maybe protecting herself. I don't know what happened between you two. I only know what came after. What I remember most is her music, the way she used to hum while cooking, or how she'd tap rhythms into my back to help me sleep. She never played publicly again after I came into her life. Maybe you know why. I didn't. Not until I was older. She never called me her secret, but she lived like I was one. I'm not here to ruin your life. I don't want headlines or drama. I just wanted to look into your eyes and see if you knew, if you ever knew. She died with a song unfinished. I think it was for you, or maybe for me, maybe for both. Take care of her violin. She played it until her hands gave out. And if you ever hear the song again, finish it, even if you don't believe I have the right to. Micah. Julian read the letter twice, then again. Each word hit with the cold precision of a scalpel, not dramatic, not begging, just the truth, uncompromising and heavy. He folded the letter slowly, placed it back on the piano, and looked at the violin under glass. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't see an artifact of grief. He saw a question, one that had waited far too long to be asked. Morning crept into the Werner estate with a soft, golden light, but Julian's world remained untouched by it, still caught somewhere between disbelief and betrayal. He hadn't slept. The letter sat unopened again on the piano, though he had read it half a dozen times the night before. His jaw clenched as he stood in the kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hand. The words echoed with cruel clarity. Arya was my mother. She lived like I was a secret. He slammed the cup down. Within minutes he was in his study, sleek, immaculate, full of control. A space untouched by Arya, untouched by emotion. He picked up the phone and dialed directly. "Elise," he said, his voice sharp. His personal assistant answered instantly. "Good morning, Mr. Werner. I need you to find someone. Name's Micah, early 20s. May have been raised in France, could be connected to Arya. Start with music academies, student registries, performance halls, whatever gets you a trace. Discreetly." There was a pause. Understood any last name? Julian hesitated. "No," he muttered. "Just Micah, that's all he gave me." "I'll contact a private firm. Anything else?" "Yes." He stood, walking over to the window, staring out at the vast estate like it suddenly meant nothing. "Get Davis on the line. I want legal clarity. If this boy decides to go public, I want to know what he can and can't touch, including the estate and the foundation. Right away." He hung up and leaned both hands on the edge of the desk, the wood cold beneath his fingers. The rage was there, low and simmering, not at Micah, not even at Arya, but at the not knowing, at being blindsided in a life he had built on certainty. He had buried Arya with reverence, mourned her with dignity, protected her memory like something sacred. Now the story was unraveling, one truth, one letter at a time. He whispered to himself, under his breath like an oath. "She would have told me." And yet a voice inside him answered back. "Would she?" The thought lingered like a crack in glass, small but fatal. The music room felt different now. Not haunted, exactly, but unsettled. The kind of space where something had been stirred and left unfinished. Julian sat alone once more, the letter still untouched beside him, but his attention had shifted to something else. A leather-bound notebook, tucked into the back of a drawer Arya hadn't opened in years. He had found it accidentally, reaching for a score she had once composed. The journal wasn't dated on the cover, just a single word scrawled across it in Arya's looping handwriting. B. He turned the pages slowly. Memory spilled out, not in paragraphs but in phrases, half-finished thoughts, sketches of sound and life. "The first time I played on the street, someone cried. That meant more than any audition. He doesn't understand what silence does to me. He fills every room with certainty, beautiful, terrible certainty. Is love a compromise or a surrender?" Julian closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The voice on the page wasn't the aria the world had seen in photographs with him. It was the one he met backstage, years ago, when she was still performing in bare feet and tuning her violin by ear. She had been fire, untamed, magnetic, maddening. She refused to wear gowns, hated rehearsals, and once walked out of a symphony audition because they asked her to tone it down. He had loved her for it, until the world demanded something different. He remembered the first time he proposed. She laughed, as if marriage was a joke she had already heard. She said, "I wasn't made for chandeliers and charity galas." It took 2 more years, 3 more breakups, and one near-death illness for her to finally say yes. But the cost had been high. Julian remembered the quiet arguments, the gentle, persistent ways he'd nudged her to change for her own good, the stylists, the new wardrobe, the invitations to dinners where she had to smile and not speak too freely, the press releases that introduced her as Mrs. Werner, patron of the arts instead of aria artist. "I gave up the stage for him," one entry read, scrawled harder than the rest. "But I didn't give up the music. That part of me doesn't ask permission." Julian closed the journal, a dull ache forming behind his chest. He had never read her words like this before, not through quotes in magazines, not through interviews crafted by PR teams, but raw, unfiltered. And suddenly, the letter from Micah didn't seem like an attack. It felt like a consequence of a woman slowly carving away pieces of herself to fit into someone else's empire. His. The old theater stood like a skeleton of its former self, brick cracked, windows fogged with time, its marquee long since missing letters. But inside it still held echoes. Echoes of music, of feet on stage, of voices once bright with dreams. Julian stood at the entrance, coat drawn tight against the cold, eyes scanning the dim interior. Dust shimmered in the filtered light through a broken skylight. The scent of wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. He stepped forward, his polished shoes sounding too loud on the worn floorboards. Micah was already there. He sat at the edge of the stage, back hunched, tuning the old violin in his lap, the same one he had played before. His expression was unreadable, focused, but closed. Julian cleared his throat lightly. Micah didn't look up. "You're persistent." "I've had to be," Julian replied. Silence stretched between them. Micah adjusted a peg, drew the bow across a string, then finally glanced up. "What do you want?" "I came to talk." "About what?" Micah asked, standing. "You didn't seem too interested in talking when I left the letter." Julian took a step closer, carefully. "That was before I read it, before I started to believe it." Micah raised an eyebrow. "I didn't ask for your belief. I didn't ask for anything." There was a long pause. "Then why come to my house?" Julian asked. "Why play that song? Why leave the letter at all?" Micah's jaw tightened, and for a moment Julian thought he wouldn't answer. But then, "I wanted the truth to exist, even if you chose not to see it." He took a breath, then added more firmly, "And I wanted my mother's violin." Julian's eyes narrowed. "The violin belongs to her estate, and legally." Micah cut in, his tone suddenly sharp. "Legally? You think this is about legality?" He took a step forward, his voice low and steady. "That violin was the last thing she touched before she died. She carried it more than she carried me. She whispered to it when she couldn't sleep." He paused, voice catching just barely. "I'm not here for your name or your money or some empty seat at your dinner table. I'm not a story for your publicist to bury." He held Julian's gaze. "I just want what she would have given me if you weren't standing in the way." Julian looked at him, unsure of how to respond. There was no threat in Micah's voice, only sorrow worn thin into steel. "I'll be gone after that," Micah said quietly. "You won't see me again." Julian didn't move. He couldn't. Something inside him, something old and frozen, had begun to stir, and it terrified him, because for the first time in years he wasn't sure he was right. and for the first time ever, he wasn't sure he had been good. The drive back to the estate was long, but Julian barely noticed the road. The city blurred past his windows, lights and shadows blending together like brushstrokes on a canvas he couldn't focus on. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles pale against the leather. Micah's voice echoed in his mind. "I just want what she would have given me if you weren't standing in the way." Julian inhaled sharply, as if the air itself resisted him. Back home, he didn't go to the study or the music room. He walked straight to his bedroom, stood in the doorway, and stared at the untouched side of the bed. Her side. Arya had no secrets she couldn't have. But the journal still sat on his desk. The words were there, quiet but relentless. The doubts she'd never spoken aloud. The music she'd composed in secret. He poured himself a drink, something stronger than wine, and stood by the window, watching the cold fog snake through the garden. For the first time in years, the house felt like it wasn't his. Like someone else had walked through it, left footprints he hadn't seen. His mind wrestled with possibilities. If Arya really had a child, how could she not tell me? But then again, hadn't she been trying in her own way, in the letters, in the music, in the silences between their carefully curated lives? And what if Micah was lying? What if the boy had studied her work, mimicked her style, learned her history just enough to spin a convincing story? He had motive. He had youth. He had grief, real or fabricated. Julian swirled the amber liquid in his glass and sat on the edge of the bed. But if he's lying, why didn't he ask for anything? That was the part that unsettled him the most. Micah hadn't asked for money or recognition. He had asked for her violin, not because of its value, but because of what it meant. It wasn't the request of someone looking to take. It was the request of someone trying to reclaim something lost. Julian closed his eyes, letting the weight settle deeper. Was our love real, or was it tailored, filtered to fit my world? Had Arya been shrinking herself, quietly, piece by piece, while he had praised her for her elegance, her poise, her restraint? The thought twisted in his gut. He didn't know which truth scared him more. That Micah was lying, or that Arya had died carrying a truth she never trusted him enough to share. It started with a headline buried in the arts section of a second-rate digital tabloid. Mystery violinist linked to late Arya Werner, son of Julian Werner. Julian saw it 2 days after the meeting with Micah. He was scrolling absently through the news on his tablet over breakfast, half distracted, until the names caught his eye, his and Arya's, tied together in bold, speculative print. He clicked. The article was light on facts but rich in insinuation. It detailed Micah's surprise performance in the abandoned theater, mentioned an anonymous source who had seen Julian in the audience, and speculated about a hidden child, long kept secret from the media and the Werner Tech board. They even used an old photo of Arya, hair loose, laughing mid-note, paired beside a grainy image of Micah outside the theater. Julian stared at the screen, expression unreadable. By noon, the article had been shared nearly 10,000 times. By 2 p.m., a board member called. "Julian," the voice said, calm but cold, "we've been made aware of the situation." "There is no situation," Julian replied, already packing. "Then clarify that, publicly. Our PR team needs a statement before the markets react. Shareholders don't care about the truth, they care about headlines." "I'm not making a statement about a rumor." A pause. "We understand this is personal, but your name isn't just personal property anymore. It's a brand, and a brand under fire invites consequences." Julian's jaw tensed. "Micah hasn't spoken to the press," he said quietly, "and neither have I." "That's fortunate, but we won't stay ahead of the story if you remain silent. You know how these things work. First it's a whisper, then it's a headline, then it's a liability." Another pause, this one sharper. You built Werner Tech on control, Julian. Don't lose it now. The line went dead. He stood in the middle of his office, glass walls reflecting the afternoon sun and his own unease. For a man who had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, and buried scandals before they even made it to rumor, this felt different. Personal, untouchable, and yet it was already bleeding into his legacy. He looked at the framed portrait of Arya on the wall, publicity still from a concert she never performed, chosen for how poised she looked, how elegant. She would have hated it, he realized. And somehow in that moment he hated it too. Julian never believed in looking backward. His life had been a forward march, precision, logic, momentum. But now everything urged him to retrace steps he never thought to question. He contacted a private investigator he'd used once before. Quiet, thorough, discreet. "I need to know if my wife ever traveled to France without telling me," Julian said. There was a pause on the line. "Your late wife?" "Yes, Arya Werner. Any travel records under her maiden name too, Arya Delcourt. Focus on the year after we married." 3 days later, the report arrived. A single flight, 1 week in Paris. The booking made under Delcourt. No hotel, no business on record, just a line in a registry, Rue Vaugirard Apt, 3C. Julian stared at the address for a long time. It meant nothing to him, and that fact alone disturbed him more than he could admit. By the end of the week, he was on a plane. Paris greeted him with gray skis and cold air, as if the city itself remembered the secrets it had kept. The building on Rue Vaugirard was modest, stone-faced, ivy-lined, old but dignified. He climbed the stairs slowly, his footsteps muffled by time. The landlord, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, had no trouble remembering Arya. She was quiet but kind, always humming, she said in French, smiling faintly. Stayed for just over a week, said she was here to write something important. Julian asked if anything had been left behind. The woman nodded, disappearing into a back room. When she returned, she held a small, cloth-bound box. Inside was a tape recorder, analog, well-worn, along with a labeled cassette. Echo Final AD. Final Echo. Julian's throat tightened. Back in his hotel room, he found an old player in a vintage shop and sat on the edge of the bed, holding the recorder in both hands. He pressed play. The first sound was a soft breath. Then slowly a violin began to weep, not perform, not impress, just speak. It was Arya's playing, he'd know it anywhere, but the melody was unfamiliar, fragile, searching, like someone walking a tightrope with eyes closed. And then her voice. "This is, for the parts I never said out loud." A long silence. "If you're hearing this, I probably never had the courage to tell you in person, but I had to leave it somewhere, had to put it into something real. I couldn't carry everything forever, Julian. I tried." The music swelled again, her violin echoing what her words couldn't. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, heart pounding in slow, aching thuds. The track ended without resolution. No final note, no signature. Just silence. And in that silence, he heard everything she had left unsaid. It was a Sunday afternoon in Montmartre, overcast, cool, with a breeze that carried the scent of bread and rain through narrow cobblestone streets. Tourists lingered near cafes, artists lined the sidewalks sketching strangers for coins, and at the edge of a small square, a semicircle of people had gathered around a young man with a violin. Julian stood at a distance just beyond the crowd. No security, no entourage. Just a man in a long dark coat, collar turned up, hands in his pockets as if holding himself together. Micah was playing. No stage, no microphone, just him and the street. The violin, familiar and worn, caught the light in places Arya's had once glinted. But it was more than the instrument. It was how he moved, shoulders slightly forward, eyes half closed. The way he bent into the bow, drawing sound from the strings like it hurt to let go. Julian didn't breathe. He could see her in him, not in face or voice but in presence. Arya used to play like that, especially when she thought no one was watching. There was no performance in it, no polish, just raw, unruly feeling. Micah played a piece Julian didn't recognize. It started slow, in minor thirds, meandering like a question. Then it rose urgently, almost angrily, and for a moment Julian thought it might shatter. And then, just as suddenly, it quieted. The last few notes trembled in the air, not ending so much as slipping away. Silence followed, then applause. People smiled, dropped coins into the open violin case and began to drift. Julian didn't move, couldn't. He felt something break, quietly, cleanly, like glass cracking beneath the weight of a forgotten memory. His eyes burned, and before he could stop it, a single tear rolled down his cheek. He hadn't cried since Arya's funeral, not even then, not really. Now, in a foreign street, watching a boy who might be her son and might not, he wept. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just honestly. Micah didn't notice him. He had already packed up, slipping his violin into its case. Someone called his name from across the square. He turned, smiled faintly, and disappeared down the narrow alley behind the cafe. Julian remained where he was, alone in a crowd that no longer noticed him. And for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't sure whether what he was feeling was grief or grace. 2 days later, the story erupted. What had been quiet speculation in obscure corners of the internet suddenly ignited across major headlines. Someone had leaked a high-resolution photo of Micah's street performance, alongside a blurry image of Julian watching from the back of the crowd. The caption was merciless. Werner's secret son, musical prodigy or illegitimate heir. Micah's phone lit up nonstop. Messages, calls, requests for interviews, questions wrapped in bated sympathy. He ignored them all, until they showed up in person. It was late afternoon. Micah was exiting the music school where he gave lessons twice a week. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, a man with a camera rushed forward. "Micah, Micah," the voice barked. "Just one question, are you Julian Werner's son?" Micah blinked, stunned. "What?" Another voice jumped in, a woman this time, microphone in hand. "Is it true? Were you hidden all these years by Arya Werner? Why are you only coming forward now?" A second cameraman moved in too fast, nearly tripping over Micah's violin case. "I didn't, this is not." Micah tried to step back, but they surrounded him. People had begun to stare. "Did Mr. Werner ever acknowledge you as his son? Are you entitled to his estate? Are you?" "Back off," Micah shouted, pushing one of them aside. His voice cracked, shaking more with fear than anger. They didn't stop. A hand grabbed at his shoulder. Another tried to hold up a phone close to his face. That's when Micah shoved harder, spinning out of the circle, stumbling into the street, barely dodging a passing cyclist. He slipped on the slick pavement and hit the curb hard, scraping his arm and bruising his ribs on impact. The camera caught it all. Someone yelled to call an ambulance, but Micah, breath ragged, staggered to his feet and shouted at them all, his voice hoarse. "I'm not anyone's story." Then he ran away from the crowd, from the questions, from the flashing lenses. Blood streaked his sleeve. Pain throbbed in his side, but none of it hurt more than the weight pressing into his chest. He had only wanted to protect her memory. And now the world had turned it into spectacle. The news hit Julian mid-meeting. He was seated at the head of a long, glass conference table inside Werner Tech's executive wing, surrounded by polished suits and careful silences. A junior aide slipped him a phone with a whispered, "You'll want to see this." On the screen, a shaky video clip, Micah, flanked by reporters shouting, bleeding, fleeing. The headline below it blinked in real time. alleged son of Julian Werner assaulted by press. Company remained silent. The room was quiet, but all eyes had shifted toward him. Julian stood up without a word. An hour later, cameras gathered outside a private clinic in Paris. The air buzzed with questions, microphones poised like weapons. Then, from a sleek black car, Julian Werner stepped out. Every reporter froze. He wore no tie. His coat hung open, rain spotting the shoulders. But his posture was firm and his face unreadable as always, except for the flicker of something fierce behind his eyes. He entered the clinic without answering a single question. Inside, he found Micah sitting on a hospital bed, arm bandaged, a bruise blooming along his side. The boy looked exhausted, eyes rimmed red, expression wary. Micah didn't speak first. Julian did. "I should have protected you sooner." Micah looked away. "I'm not yours to protect." Julian sat beside him anyway, careful, quiet. Outside, the press waited. 10 minutes later, Julian emerged again. He walked directly to the nearest microphone, ignoring the chaos of shouted questions. His voice was calm but clipped, every word precise. "This is a private matter. It concerns my late wife, Aria Werner, and a young man she deeply loved. It does not concern Werner Tech, its operations, or its investors. Any further pursuit of this story, especially the harassment of this individual, will be met with legal action. That is all." He turned and walked back into the clinic, without waiting for applause or reaction. By morning, the board called an emergency session. They were not pleased. "You made a public statement without clearance." "I made a personal statement," Julian replied. "You did it while standing beside someone the media now calls your son. He isn't seeking status or stake, he wants peace." A long silence followed. One of the senior members leaned forward. "Julian, we're not just dealing with PR. Investors are calling. Stock is fluctuating. If this boy becomes a symbol, we all suffer. It's not about truth, it's about perception." Another added, colder, "You're free to feel whatever guilt you want, but don't let it cost the company." Julian didn't flinch. But later, alone in his office, he watched the video again. The moment Micah fell, the fear in his face, the blood on his sleeve. He had built his empire to withstand storms. But this was a storm of his own making. And this time he couldn't buy silence. The boardroom was colder than usual. 12 members sat around the polished oval table, their expressions carved from marble, controlled, cautious, already decided. The blinds were drawn tight. No media, no press, just power and the reshuffling of it. Julian sat at the head, still in the same chair he had occupied for nearly 2 decades. The weight of the room was not unfamiliar to him, but for the first time it pressed on his chest like a judgment rather than a privilege. The lead counsel stood, clearing his throat. "We are convening, as per corporate protocol, to vote on the temporary suspension of Mr. Julian Werner from the position of chairman and CEO, effective immediately." Julian didn't interrupt. A week ago he might have fought, brought numbers, made calls, leaned on legacy. Now he didn't even look at them. The motion was read, formal and cold. One by one the votes came in. "Lie, lie, lie." Julian kept his hands folded on the table. His reflection stared back at him from the glossed surface, older than he remembered, tired in ways that had nothing to do with age. Only 2 abstained, none opposed. The gavel came down, with a finality far quieter than it felt. An hour later he walked out of the building through the side entrance. No press, no ceremony, just a black town car waiting at the curb and the sound of his own footsteps on the marble floor, once a symbol of everything he'd built. Now it echoed like an ending. The car door shut with a heavy thud. Inside, he sat in silence, staring out the window as the city passed him by in blurred reflections. skyscrapers he had funded, foundations bearing his name, towers of glass that had once made him feel untouchable. He touched the space over his chest. Not for pain, for the sudden, quiet absence. Not just of power, but of certainty. Of the story he thought he'd lived, of the woman he thought he'd known, of the legacy he thought he'd earned. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. The door opened slowly. Micah stood in the frame of a modest apartment tucked into a quiet corner of Paris, violin case resting against a coat rack, a steaming mug in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see Julian, just tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones. "You found me," he said, voice neutral. "I wasn't trying to," Julian replied quietly. "I just needed to talk." Micah hesitated, then stepped aside. 5 minutes, he said. "That's all I've got in me." They sat at a small kitchen table, the kind meant for quiet breakfasts, not confessions. Julian didn't touch the tea Micah had poured. He folded his hands, stared at the grain of the wood, then finally looked up. "Did Arya ever talk about me?" Micah didn't answer right away. "She mentioned you," he said after a moment, gaze distant. "Not often, but when she did, her voice got softer, like she was remembering something that hurt too much to hold for long." Julian's throat tightened. "She said," Micah continued, "you were the most brilliant man she'd ever known, and also the loneliest." Julian looked away, jaw tense. Micah leaned back in his chair. "She said you were the man she loved, but not the man she could live as herself with." The words landed without malice. They weren't meant to wound, only to explain, and perhaps that made them cut deeper. Julian swallowed hard. "I gave her everything," he said, almost to himself. Micah nodded slowly, "except space." Silence fell between them, heavy but not hostile. "I don't hate you," Micah added quietly. "I thought I might, I really did, but I don't. I think you were just too big, and she was trying so hard not to disappear." Julian let out a breath that sounded like surrender. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in release. "I thought I knew her," he whispered. Micah didn't argue. Instead, he reached for the old cassette player on the nearby shelf and pressed play. A violin crackled through the static aria's unfinished melody, soft, aching, incomplete. They sat in silence, letting her voice fill the space she once might have called home. It was the first honest moment they shared. And it didn't need anything more. The tape wound to a stop with a soft click, and the silence that followed felt sacred. Julian sat still, as if frozen in that final note. Micah stood, walked to the window and looked out at the gray Parisian street below. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, without turning around, Micah said softly, "There's something else I need to tell you." Julian looked up, weary but listening. "I'm not her son," Micah said. Julian blinked. "What?" Micah turned to face him. His eyes weren't guarded this time. They were steady, open, brutally so. "She didn't give birth to me. I wasn't hers by blood. I was left behind." Julian stared at him, lips slightly parted. "My mother, Arya's sister, died in a car accident when I was just a baby. I don't remember her. No one talks about her. Arya never even said her name." He sat down again, slowly, as if the weight of the truth made it harder to breathe. "They were close, I think. I found one picture once, two girls playing violin in a dusty backyard, laughing like they owned the world. After the accident, Arya took me in, quietly. No paperwork, no announcements, just me and her and music." Julian's voice was hoarse. "Why didn't she tell me?" Micah looked at him, pain flickering beneath the calm. "Because she was afraid." "Afraid of me?" "No," Micah said gently. "Afraid of losing you." Julian's breath caught. "She built a life that fit you," Micah continued. "Perfect on the outside, sharp edges polished smooth, and I didn't fit in it. I was her past, her burden, her guilt. So she kept me in the shadows, loved me quietly, fiercely, but always from the margins. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photo and sliding it across the table. A young Arya, beaming, holding a toddler in her arms. Her hair was wild. Her eyes were free. She told me once, when I asked why she never married again after you, that some people only get one true love. And she was lucky enough to have had hers, even if she had to lose herself to keep it. Julian touched the edge of the photo with trembling fingers. She gave up so much, he whispered. Micah nodded, and she never blamed you, not once. There was no anger in his voice, only truth. And in that moment, Julian felt a grief deeper than any he'd known, not just for Arya's absence, but for all the pieces of her he had never been allowed to see. And for the first time he realized, she hadn't left him behind. She had simply been carrying more than he ever saw. Micah rose from his chair and crossed the small apartment to a bookshelf lined with old tapes and worn notebooks. He sifted through a box, quiet and careful, as if handling something sacred. I wasn't going to show you this, he said softly, but I think you need to hear it. He pulled out a small cassette, unlabeled except for a faded sticker that read simply, July 19 late. He set it into the player on the table, the same one they'd used to listen to Arya's unfinished melody, and pressed play. The familiar hiss of old tape filled the room. Then Arya's voice, quieter than before, shaky, like she'd been crying just moments before recording. If you're listening, I guess it means I never had the courage to say it aloud. Julian stiffened. His eyes didn't move from the cassette player. Julian, I know this will hurt you. I know what you'll feel, betrayal, maybe anger, maybe worse. But please believe me, I never meant for it to be a lie. It was never a lie to me. There was a pause, just her breath, then a soft, broken laugh. You used to tell me that everything could be managed, planned, that the world respected control, but love doesn't work like that. Micah came into my life like a storm, and I didn't have the heart to shut the door. Micah looked down, hands resting on his lap. He isn't mine by blood, but he is mine in every other way. He gave me something I didn't even know I was missing, a second kind of love, one that asked nothing of me except to show up, every day. Her voice cracked. But I knew what it would mean if I told you. I knew your world, I knew the pressure, the image, the expectations, and I knew you'd never forgive me for keeping him. Another pause, long this time. She took a breath, then said the words that stopped Julian cold. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you would have found a way to love him too, but I couldn't risk it. I couldn't let Micah grow up unloved because I was afraid of losing you. The tape ended abruptly. Micah pressed stop. Silence returned to the room, but it was a different kind of silence now. Full, weighted, trembling with things too late to say and too impossible to forget. Julian didn't speak. He just sat there, head bowed, hands clenched in his lap. He didn't need to ask if the voice was real. He already knew. The invitation came without ceremony. A short message, sent by Julian 2 days later. If you're still in Paris, the house is open. The piano is tuned. Micah didn't reply. But that evening, just as the sky over the Seine began to dim, he arrived at the Werner estate. No cameras, no press, just him and a familiar, restless weight in his chest. The manor was silent when he stepped inside, the way old places often are, full of echoes but void of sound. Julian met him in the music room, where the fire crackled softly, and the walls still carried the scent of Arya's favorite cedar oil. She wasn't there, but somehow, she was everywhere. The violin rested on a cushioned stand beside the piano, no longer under glass. It looked smaller now, humble, vulnerable, real. Julian stood by the piano, waiting. There were no words of greeting. None were needed. Micah walked forward, picked up the violin, and cradled it like something fragile. Julian sat at the piano, his hands hovering above the keys. For a moment, neither moved. Then Julian played the first chord. Micah followed, tentatively at first. The melody began to unfold, hesitant, still incomplete. They had no sheet music, only memory and instinct. But slowly, note by note, they began to find each other inside the music. The room filled with the ache of something unfinished, and the beauty of trying anyway. There were falters, moments when one hesitated, when the tempo wavered, but each time the other adjusted. They gave each other space, trust, time. By the third refrain, something clicked. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The melody swelled, rising into something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite peace. Just two people meeting in the place between them, shaped by love they had both lost, and somehow found again in each other. As the final note lingered, Micah lowered the violin. His shoulders fell, breath shuddering from him. Julian didn't speak, didn't stand. They just sat there, quiet side by side. Two men once separated by silence, now bound by the music of someone they both loved. And in that shared melody, they each began to understand the other's loss, not to fix it, not to erase it, but simply to carry it together. The concert hall was bathed in warm amber light, elegant, understated, filled with people who spoke in hushed tones and wore black not for mourning, but for reverence. It was an evening dedicated to the Arya Foundation, a new initiative supporting arts education for underprivileged youth, funded quietly, almost anonymously, by Julian Werner. But tonight wasn't about corporations or headlines. Tonight was about her. The stage was simple, a single spotlight, a grand piano, and a wooden chair center stage. No banners, no grand introductions. Just a quiet program card left on every seat, embossed with Arya's name and a single phrase beneath it. For the music that never asked to be seen. In the front row, Julian sat alone. No security, no press team. Just him, a dark suit, and a small white rose in his lap. The seat beside him remained empty. Halfway through the evening, the lights dimmed once more. The MC stepped forward. Our next performance is an original piece, never published, never finished, until now. Written by Arya Delcourt Werner, completed by someone who knew her music as more than sound. No further explanation. Micah stepped onto the stage. He wore no tuxedo, just a black shirt, sleeves rolled, the violin in his hands like a second skin. He nodded once to the pianist behind him, not Julian, and the hall stilled. The first note cut through the air like a whisper in a cathedral. The piece was Vang Sao Kung, final echo, but it had evolved. What began as Arya's quiet ache had grown into something bolder, more layered. Micah had preserved her voice in the first half, then added his own, flourishes of warmth, tension, longing. It was both a farewell and a beginning. And Julian, he didn't blink once. He watched every movement, every breath, every tremor in Micah's bow hand that reminded him of Arya, her slight tilt of the head, her habit of closing her eyes on high notes, her refusal to play anything she didn't feel. As the final phrase hung in the air, Micah drew the bow slowly across the last string, an echo, soft and unfinished, dissolving into the quiet. The audience rose in silence, not out of tradition but out of awe. Micah bowed once, then stepped back, leaving the stage without a single word. Julian stood slowly. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the white rose, and gently placed it on the empty seat beside him. No one needed to be told who the seat was for. It was her chair. And the flower. Not a tribute. A thank you.